And now to Washington, where the U.S. is still struggling with how to respond to the escalating crisis. Secretary of State John Kerry is now in the region, as are U.S. military advisors, to train the Iraqi forces. Here's Chief White House correspondent John Karl.
This morning, the first two teams of those military advisors the president has decided to send to Iraq are already in Baghdad preparing to work, following this promise from the commander-in-chief.
American combat troops are not going to be fighting in Iraq again.
The decision to send special forces to help train the Iraqi army comes after a week of tense deliberations with his national security team. But perhaps the biggest question the White House now faces: should the president give the order for airstrikes? Aside from obvious targets of opportunity, two things could trigger a larger military operation: intelligence showing a direct threat to U.S. interests, or progress by the Iraqi government finally overcoming the sectarian divide now tearing Iraq apart.
If we don't see Sunni, Shia, and Kurd political support for what we're doing, then we won't do it.
And back home, his policy is under fire from both sides.
300 Americans is not going to solve the problem of stopping the advance of this group that is more extreme than literally core al-Qaeda.
What is the objective of these up to 300 military advisors that he's proposing? What will they be able to accomplish that has not already been tried and failed before?
All of this comes at an especially difficult time in Obama's presidency. A new poll shows his approval rating has sunk to 41%, and a mere 37% approve of his handling of foreign policy, the very issue second-term presidents often rely on to stay relevant. For This Week, Jonathan Karl, ABC News, Washington.
And we'll have much more from John later in the show. But right now, we want to turn to the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General James Cartwright, and Colonel Stephen Ganyard, a former F-18 pilot and also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. General Cartwright, I want to start with you. The situation in Al-Qaim, the border town with Syria. This is a very serious turn of events.
It is, Martha. It represents the opportunity for ISIS to establish safe havens and escape pursuit by either Syrian forces or Iraqi forces, should they decide to be able to muster that kind of effort. It also creates the opportunity for ISIS to move further, to move forces into Iraq. They now occupy about 300 to 400 kilometers along the Euphrates River. They are in a very commanding position. It is likely that this is somewhat of a defining moment for them, in that if they can hold these positions and lock them down, it is unlikely Iraq, as we envisioned it, will ever return.
And Colonel Ganyard, about ISIS, Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, who was killed in 2006. ISIS has been described as Zarqawi on steroids.
I think it's interesting to use the Zarqawi analogy, because ISIS is very much the follow-on organization from Zarqawi's Islamic State in Iraq that the United States battled in 2006 and 2007. But this is a much more capable military outfit. If we want to anticipate what's next, we ought to think about when the U.S. killed Zarqawi in 2006. They found on his body a handwritten drawing that showed encirclement of Baghdad that came to be called the Baghdad Belts. So we know that ISIS is not going to stop. We think that Baghdad is the goal. And so what we got to look for next is the potential encirclement of Baghdad by ISIS to choke off the city and bring down the Maliki regime.
And 130,000 U.S. troops had a hard time handling them then. General Cartwright, how on earth are 300 military advisors from the U.S. going to make a difference?
The vulnerability for ISIS right now is that it's extremely stretched. 400 kilometers is a long ways to move men and equipment to encircle Baghdad. And if there is to be some offensive on the part of the Iraqi forces as they exist today, those advisors will help try to create some sort of a scenario in which those lines of communication can be cut off and supplies can be withdrawn or at least hindered from making it down to an encirclement around Baghdad.
And I want to turn to Colonel Ganyard. What about the possibility of airstrikes?
The airstrikes, there are difficulties because we're not going to have U.S. eyes and boots on the ground to be able to pick out targets. That said, out in the west where we see the supplies coming in from Syria, there may be places where U.S. air power can hit supply convoys, where you find ISIS out in the open. But once the fight comes closer to the city and we get into urban areas, it's going to be very tough to pick out those targets. And we need to be very careful because as soon as we drop that first bomb or shoot that first hellfire, we have picked sides. And we need to make sure that we're picking sides for an Iraqi government that's inclusive and that we aren't making a broader determination of Sunni versus Shia within the regional perspective.
Thanks very much to both of you.